Okay, so in the last part we touched upon the carbon cycle when we talk about respiration and photosynthesis, but let's see how that all fits together. Okay, so to start with, in the early atmosphere, the atmosphere was mostly carbon dioxide. When the volcano started spewing up the carbon dioxide, there's loads and loads of carbon dioxide. Okay, so let's see how that becomes balanced. Okay, and we come into something known as a cycle, where there's ways for it to go into it and ways for it to go out of it, and let's have a look then. Okay, so let's start off with green plants because they're probably the most important thing. So if we've got some green plants, and what the green plants do is they do something called photosynthesis. And what that does is that takes in carbon dioxide. So I'll draw an arrow in to show that that's going into it, and I'll use a nice blue arrow for my carbon. So photosynthesis takes in carbon dioxide. So CO2 is going into plants in photosynthesis. And what's being given out is oxygen, and what's being made is glucose, which is the way that the plants store their energy. Okay, and then you've got a few options for what happens to that carbon dioxide that's trapped in these plants. Okay, option number one is that those plants are eaten by an animal. Okay, so the carbon then goes into the animal. That's the first route for it to go. Now maybe the plant was lucky and it didn't get eaten, and instead what happens was it died. And then when it died, that carbon is then released, carbon dioxide, because instead of getting eaten by an animal, it gets eaten by something else. And the something else that it gets eaten by is a microorganism, usually bacteria. And when they do that, well, it's exactly the same as being eaten by an animal, except instead of being eaten by a big animal, you're being eaten by a very small animal. But it's the same process. Okay, so you're getting eaten by a very small animal called a microorganism, usually bacteria. So CO2 is released by the animal and by the microorganisms in a process called respiration. And that returns that CO2 back into the atmosphere. So both microorganisms and bigger organisms respire, so they both give off CO2. Okay. Now what happens if you don't get eaten or you don't get broken down by microorganisms? Well, then that's about as lucky as you can get for a plant. And what happens to you then is you get turned into, so for example, if it died and it was immediately covered over by lots of mud, or if you died and you're covered over by tar or peat or something where there isn't very much oxygen or water, then you'll find that you get turned into a fossil, and that's called fossilization. Okay, so there's one other place where the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere can go to, which I haven't mentioned yet, and that is oceans. Okay, so CO2 can go into oceans in a process called dissolving, and equally, when the oceans heat up, they will give some of that CO2 back. And so these are known as a CO2 store, because it will store CO2 in the oceans at a certain temperature. But if the oceans get hotter, they can't store as much, so they release some. So that tends to be as much goes in as comes out, but if the temperature increases, they give off more CO2. Okay, so the only bit that I haven't talked about is where does the carbon that's tied up in fossils go to? Okay, well, it can go to one of two places. Either it can go into rocks, such as calcium carbonate, and the clue's in the name, carbonate, which is chalk. So there's a lot of carbon that's tied up in rocks. Or it can be turned into a fossil fuel, such as oil, coal or gas. And what happens is that humans come along, they dig up the fossil fuel, so say it's oil, and then they set fire to that fossil fuel to burn it for fuel in a process called combustion. So when you put petrol into your car or coal on a fire, that's combustion of fossil fuels. And what that is doing is that's releasing the CO2 that was tied up in these dead plants for millions of years and popping it back into the atmosphere. Okay. That, oh, you can't quite see the oceans. Plus the ocean store is the carbon cycle. So just to quickly recap, photosynthesis of plants takes in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. When the plants are living, they might be eaten by animals. When the animals respire, they might give off the CO2. When both the plants and the animals die, because obviously animals can die as well, then they are both broken down by microorganisms, most usually bacteria, and they're the same as the big organisms except smaller, and so they also respire. So when they eat the dead plants and animals, they give off CO2 then. Now not all of the dead plants and animals are eaten by microorganisms. Sometimes there might not be enough water or oxygen around for the microorganisms to live, so they get turned into fossils in a process called fossilization. And then they can get stored in one of two ways. They can either get stored in the rocks, such as calcium carbonate, which is chalk, or they might get stored in a fossil fuel. Now if they get stored in a fossil fuel, such as oil, coal or gas, then humans will come along, dig it up, and burn it in a process called combustion, which releases that CO2 back into the atmosphere. And don't forget about the oceans, of course, where some CO2 goes in, it's dissolved, and some CO2 comes out when it warms up, when the oceans warm up. Okay, because the oceans can only hold a certain amount of CO2 before they're full of CO2.